Very excited. Hello everyone. My name is Angel Sharif. I am a professor of neurology at UT Health in Houston, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Howard, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and an internationally recognized leader in stroke epidemiology. He has contributed so substantially to our knowledge of stroke and stroke disparities. He is a PI of the REGARD study that many of you likely know about. So Reasons for Geographic and Racial Differences in Stroke, that has had several, I think over 850 publications come from the REGARDS data, over $100 million in funding for the REGARD study. He has received many awards, most recently the University of Alabama Birmingham Distinguished Faculty Lecturer Award, which is one of the most prestigious awards at the university. So join me in welcoming Dr. Howard. He's going to talk about, his title is Shouldn't We Be Going Upstream to Find the Causes of Racial Disparities in Stroke?
Well, thanks to Bruce, and I'm honored to be here. This is just a wonderful conference and a wonderful idea. Does this work? I hope. No. Does this work? Yes. And so basically my title is Shouldn't We Be Going Upstream to find racial disparities in stroke? As somebody who's spent most of his career trying to figure out black-white differences in stroke and geographic differences in stroke, this should really be subtitled, Gee, didn't I just waste my career? Okay. And the reason for that, I want to start with sort of a very bittersweet data slide. So the sweet part of it is this is stroke mortality since the late 60s. It has declined 75%, unbelievable. It has been recognized as one of the top 10 public health victories of, top 10 victories. That is the curve for blacks. This is the curve for whites. That is amazing. I would have never guessed any two curves in nature could be that parallel. Every time one jumps up, the other one jumps up. They just perfectly reflect each other. And so while black stroke mortality has declined 75%, if we talk about racial disparities in stroke, through 50 years of hard work, we have reduced the black-white disparity in stroke from a 34% excess all the way down to a 40% excess. We are failing miserably at reducing the racial stroke disparity, unbelievably failing, okay? But that's the good news. The bad news is if you look at it by age group, this is back in 1949, and you can see that it's not a 40% excess, but a 400% excess for people 65 and under. Unbelievable disparities. And if you look at that now, some of the big lines have gone away, and we tend to focus on those big lines. Your eyes are drawn to the big lines. And yes, the stroke mortality in people 45 to 54 has gone down, but actually the stroke disparity in people 65 to 74, where there are a lot more strokes, has actually increased from like 1.4 to 1.7. So it's getting worse with the older people. And likewise for people with 75 to 84, blacks used to be protected. Now they're up to about 140% higher. Okay. So if we want to fix this, what do we know and what do we need to know? But what we know is that more African Americans die from stroke than their white counterparts. Mortality data, death certificate data. But mortality is incidence times case fatality. And if you think about this, so is it that blacks are having more strokes? Is it that African Americans are more likely to die once they have a stroke, or both? And what does this have to do with targeting interventions? If I want to change it, why do I care about this? And it turns out that if it's stroke incidence, if that's what's driving the disparity, then we need to focus on pre-stroke prevention and stop African Americans from having a stroke in the first place. That means we need to be in the population, dealing in the community. On the other hand, if it's case fatality is driving the disparity, then we need to be focused on improved healthcare in the hospital. We need to be working in the hospital, making sure that everybody gets TPA and such. And so that has profound implications. And I'm going to talk about this for a little while and focus on data from the REGARD study for people who are not familiar. It's a general population study, free range adults, just you and me, okay? It was central participant recruitment and telephone interview. We recruited about 30,000 people. The map shows where they're from, with the blue dots being African Americans and the red dots being white folks. About half of them are from the stroke belt, a half from the non-stroke belt, about 40% African American. We followed up that central interview by going into their homes and doing a very, very brief, very cursory evaluation. And then we've been following these people at 6-month intervals for stroke and also cognitive decline. If you want to know more about the study, or if you want to write papers from regards, we welcome people coming in and using our data. In fact, we will do the analysis for you for free as long as you promise to write the paper. Okay? Don't come back the second time for us to do analysis unless the paper's been submitted. So what about Black-white disparities in stroke incidence? The title is slid over. In your mind's eye, pretend that circle is circling the word incidence, okay? Not mortality, but incidence, people having stroke. And so this is the Black-white hazard ratio for having stroke by age. And you have seen that graph before for mortality, where basically the pattern nearly perfectly mirrors the previously shown pattern for mortality, 2.5 times the risk for young people, no difference at older people. How about case fatality, the other thing it could be? And so basically what we did here was examine 30-day case fatality following stroke. There were no interactions with age, race, and sex. And if you look at the Black-white difference in case fatality, only a smidgen elevated, not enough to really make a big difference, and non-significantly elevated. So we're seeing a pattern exactly like mortality for incidence and no association for case fatality, which leads us to believe, by the way, those findings are nearly perfectly mirrored in a very wonderful study, the Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky Stroke Study. Same results, except they showed lower case fatality for African Americans. So if Black-white disparities are going to be reduced, we must focus on stroke prevention in Blacks, not treatment, stroke prevention. The disparity is nearly all less than 75, and so we need to be thinking young folks. Every year for me, younger and younger folks. There's only a suggestion that only minor gains are going to be made by improving stroke prevention in Black. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to improve stroke prevention, but it's not the way to eliminate the disparity. So this is the first time in this talk I'm going to say we should be looking upstream. We need to be stopping folks from having stroke, not treating them better. So what places African Americans at higher risk for stroke? So this is the Black to white hazard ratio, same data that you've seen before, but now as a continuous variable. Black to white hazard ratio is a function of age. And so it could be the risk for everybody knows African Americans have more hypertension and diabetes. That's the first thing everybody says, okay? So what happens if we adjust for the Framingham stroke risk factors? Because if it's the risk factors that's driving it, that brown line will come down and be mediated all the way down and be at 1. That's called mediation analysis, hot new topic. So what actually happens when we adjust for just the Framingham risk factors? We move from the brown line to the green line. Yes, it does attenuate it. In fact, it attenuates at about 40%. The interpretation of that is about 40% of the Black-white difference is because, listen carefully, here's an important word, the prevalence of stroke risk factors, not treatment, the prevalence. Okay, how about if I adjust for socioeconomic status? If I adjust for socioeconomic status, I go from the green line to the blue line. Not much going on. Part of the reason not much is going on is part of the impact of socioeconomic status is through the risk factors, and they've already been adjusted for, okay? But the additional SES adjustment brings it to 50%, and the interpretation is about half of the Black-white difference has to do with the prevalence of risk factors, okay? And so basically, if we're going to change that, if we're going to reduce the black-white disparity, what do we have to do? What can we do about that? Well, for most risk factors, hypertension, diabetes, we're examining prevalent conditions, absent, present. That implies that risk factor treatment is not the key to reducing disparity, but risk factor prevention, primordial risk factor prevention. That suggests that the focus of racial disparities in stroke should perhaps change to racial disparities in stroke risk factors. I mean, we need to be going back upstream, fixing that hypertension in Blacks, fixing that diabetes in Blacks. Second time, I'm going to say we should be looking upstream. Okay. But still, we spend a lot of time and energy on blood pressure control. I'm sitting here looking at Dan Lackland in the back of the room, whose entire career is all about let's get it below 140 and 90, and now 80 at 130 and 80. Is it really, is that the answer? Will blood pressure control really solve this problem? Now, every talk, you're allowed to have one slide that has too many numbers and is too busy, and you can't see, this is my one slide with too many numbers and such. And what this is the hazard ratio for stroke as a function of the blood pressure level as columns and the number of medications they're on as rows. And everything is relative to the people, the blessed people who are naturally normotensive. Okay, and we spend all our energy on this row. We focus on that row. And basically, if you're untreated prehypertension, you're 40% higher stroke risk. My goodness, if you're stage 1 hypertension and you're not on medicine, twice the stroke risk. If you stage 2 hypertension, 3 times the stroke risk. Every one of those steps goes up by 50%. And if you look at it, the same thing is true in each one of the rows. They tend to go up in each one of the rows, and the p-value for interaction is non-significant. And so what that's saying is that the stroke risk goes up with systolic blood pressure regardless of the treatment. That is a duh. I mean, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. Fewer people focus on these columns. Okay, and if you look at the columns, if I well control somebody who's hypertensive on one medicine, get them down below 120, they're still at 40% increased risk compared to being naturally. 60% if it takes 2 meds, 2.5 times if it takes 3 meds, 30% jump for every medication it takes. That's true regardless of the level of hypertension. P-value for interaction is non-significant. And so more people are surprised that stroke risk goes up as a function of the intensity of the treatment required to control the blood pressure. The more intense the blood pressure control is, the worse trouble they're in. In fact, like I said, we spend a lot of time fretting on this cell. Well, my goodness, look at this cell. I've got the same risk if I get the person back down to below 120, but it takes me 3 meds to get there. Okay. All the people in those gray boxes that you can't quite see, it doesn't show up very well, are considered basically successfully managed. These are the winners. We've done good. Okay. They represent about 40%, about half the population are well-controlled hypertensives, all of whom are at 140 to 2.5 times the stroke risk. Okay. And so basically, achieving successful blood pressure control in hypertensives implies that half the population is going to be at twice the stroke risk. Okay? But will blood pressure control really solve the problem? I'm not saying, by the way, blood pressure hypertension control is not important, clearly critical. These slides, it really is exciting. You sort of never know what's going to come up with these slides. Yeah, but if hypertension develops and is well treated, the risk is still a lot higher. Hasn't solved the problem. Maybe the best way to control hypertension is to prevent it in the first place. Okay, third time to say we should be looking upstream. We need to be thinking about preventing hypertension, not treating it. Okay. So now all we have to do is stop the black population from having, oh, that's good. We can do this. We can do this. Gee, that might be a tough nut to crack. Suppose all I can do is simply delay it. I'm not going to prevent it. I just want to delay it. That's not easy, but might be possible. But is it even worthwhile? So what's shown on this graph, if you could read the title, it'd say intensity of treatment by duration. And for hypertensives who are treated with less than 5 years, they take about 1.6 classes of antihypertensive medications on average. For hypertensives who've been hypertensive for 6 to 10 years, 2 for 21 years plus, all the way up to almost 2.5 classes of medications. So the longer you've had hypertension, the more classes of antihypertensive medications are required. How about the achieved blood pressure levels? Well, in regards to the normotensive people, not surprisingly, 124, they have to be low, they're normotensive. But people who have 5 years of hypertension, about 130, there's 6 to 10 years, almost 132, and then 21 years, it goes straight up. And so even on treatment, blood pressure levels are higher in people who have been hypertensive longer. And then finally, the stroke risk adjusted for everything, including the blood pressure level and number of medications. I'm speeding up a little bit. You can see this is pure linear association of higher stroke risk, even on treatment, adjusted for the blood pressure levels. The longer you've had it, the higher blood pressure risk of stroke you have. Okay. So even if all I can do is delay the onset of hypertension in the Black population, the longer duration is associated with the need for more intensive therapy, higher levels of achieved blood pressure will be higher, and a higher risk of incident stroke, even at the same level of systolic blood pressure and number of medications. So preventing or delaying hypertension implies a shorter duration, and that's the fourth time I'm saying maybe we should be looking upstream and trying to do prevention instead of treatment. So my overall conclusions are the Black-white disparity in stroke is both huge and persistent. We failed miserably at reducing that disparity. It seems like we need a call to action to shift the stroke risk factors to reduce the disparity. By the way, it said a lot of reasons. That D, that's Bruce's fault too. Okay, that one's a typo. That one's a typo. To say, let's look upstream. And there are tons of targets to address prevention and delay of hypertension. And I'd like to suggest the key to reducing stroke disparities is going to be reducing stroke risk factor disparities. Okay, and I want to end with a poem, if I may. It's called The Fencer of the Ambulance. I've always loved this poem. 'Twas a dangerous cliff, as they freely confessed, though to walk near its crest was so pleasant. But over the terrible edge they had slipped a duke and a full many peasant. So the people said something has to be done, but their projects did not tally. Some said put a fence around the edge of the cliff, others an ambulance down in the valley. But the cry for the ambulance carried the day, for it spread through the neighboring city. A fence might be useful or not, it's true, but each heart became full of pity for those who slipped over that dangerous cliff, and the dwellers in the highway and alley gave pounds and gave pence, not to put up a fence, but an ambulance down in the valley. An old sage remarked, it's a marvel to me that people give far more attention to repairing results than stopping the cause when they'd much better aim at prevention. Let us stop it at its source, all this mischief, cried he. Come, neighbors and friends, let us rally. If the cliff we will fence, we could almost dispense with the ambulance down in the valley. Better guide the young than reclaim when old. The voice of true wisdom is calling. To rescue the fallen is good. 'Tis better to prevent others from falling. Better close up the source of temptation and crime than to deliver from dungeon or galley. Put a strong fence around the top of the cliff than an ambulance down in the valley. And I'll close by thanking by Joseph Malin's, written in 1895, not a new idea. It's been published a lot of times, North Carolina State Board of Health in 1993. I appreciate my funding. See, I've got the NINDS people. I'm going to make sure they know I appreciate their funding. But And most of all, the investigators, staff, and most importantly, the participants in the study. It's a team sport. I'm here talking. It's a lot of folks playing. Those are the investigators and the staff at UAB, and I'm honored to be here. Oh, well, that's just for you to read while the question. That's the whole point. But
So we'll open it up to questions. I did see one pop up in the chat. Rael, I saw a part of the question. It was about how we reach younger individuals to make sure that we're targeting the correct audience for prevention, I think is what it was. Okay.
I'm sorry, I was coughing. Was it right?
How do we reach younger individuals who are at risk for developing hypertension to kind of prevent them from developing hypertension in the first place?
And she mentioned.
So there are 7 Class 1A published theories for delaying and preventing hypertension. And actually, you have one of the world's experts in the back of the room, but I think you were on this paper too. But basically, it's everything that you would expect: diet, exercise, lose weight, quit drinking, that kind of thing. It's everything that you would expect. I think how you would implement it is a hard thing. If I say, I mean, look at me, I'm an obese researcher. How can this guy be fat and be a researcher? He knows what he's doing to himself. Turns out it's hard to change diet. Diet's a hard thing to change. I really admire England. They took out salt out of their diet by policy. About half of the salt got taken out of the food. But by the way, the main place you get salt is processed food. And so they over a period of about a decade, took out a little bit more salt every year. Nobody noticed. Blood pressure levels went down. Everything was wonderful. In the United States, we subsidize a lot of food industries. Basically, every food industry that does things that are bad for you gets subsidized. Cheese, breads, all that kind of stuff gets federal subsidies. Things like vegetables, other things don't get food subsidies. And so I think there's a lot. So I think we ought to encourage people to change their behavior and expect to fail a little bit. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I think also policy can play a big role.
Thank you. We'll take more questions. Rael, anything else from the chat that I missed? So I'll ask a question. So with your talk and the talk before, we kind of heard about how cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension influence the risk for stroke, influence the risk for dementia. So it seems that we're kind of really all working on the same topics, but kind of in silos. We've worked in silos. So we've worked on dementia, we've worked on stroke, we've worked on epilepsy, we've worked on migraine. So how do we work better together to try to shift the focus to prevention, as a collective instead of in our silos?
That one's above my pay grade, but I'll say that having conferences where cognitive speakers speak and then stroke people speak, and if you look at the bios of the other speakers, that's really a range of diseases that Bruce has organized, perhaps not by accident. And so I think I do that. In fact, I'm even bolder than you. I think if you look at risk factors for cancer, they overlap strikingly with cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, smoking. So many things are shared risk factors.
Any other questions? Yes. Use your mic if you can. Is it on?
It's a little up on button.
Oh, there we go. So if we know that if you have these risk factors, you're already increasing your stroke risk, is there any hope that if we reverse that risk factor, we are able to come off meds and have our blood pressure better controlled once you were hypertensive before or had diabetes and we're able to reverse that, does that risk kind of fall back, or can we give hope to people who already have these risk factors moving forward?
So I think your question is, for example, I'm borderline hypertensive. If I lose weight, can I quit taking my amlodipine? So basically, I think the answer is yes. I think the health impact of it is understudied and also difficult to study, because what you'd really have to really do it right, I presume, is randomize some people to lose weight and some people not to lose weight and see what happens to the level of their risk factors. And the hard part of this is that the reason why a well-controlled hypertensive is at higher risk of stroke is not completely understood. You know, maybe he's been hypertensive, she's been hypertensive for a long time, and the damage is already done. It's a cumulative sort of pack years of hypertension kind of theory. It could be that I need Dan's help. He's a co-author on this paper. I'm up here frailing away, but you know, it could be that we measure this poorly. A lot of things. So I think clearly we should try to control it. Clearly we should do behavioral changes to better control hypertension. I think that they have been shown definitively to lower blood pressure, but it's not clear that once the blood pressure is lower, the stroke risk or the heart disease risk or the cognitive trajectory of cognitive functioning would follow. I bet it will, but I don't know that.
Thank you so much. I think one more question. Okay, we can take one more question from the back.
Hello, my name is Nana. Great presentation. My question will be, how much of these is from like genetic differences, like the apolipoprotein L1 gene mediating all these risk factors and the stroke risk and the disparities that we are seeing?
I think genetics is an important field. I don't think the decline in stroke is related to a fundamental change in the genetic milieu. In other words, I think things are happening in the control of people that is bringing down stroke risk for everybody. But if you focus on black-white differences in stroke risk, that could be genetic. And it's not my area of expertise. It would be hard for me to think of the mechanism why it would be so much more important for a 45-year-old than an 80-year-old. I personally don't think it's playing a big role, but that's one guy's opinion, not backed up by data at all.
Thank you. Dr. Burbeck, I think I have one quick question. Yeah.
Just, do you have any data on the epigenetics? So I understand your answer on the genetics, but I'm very keen to think about the epigenetics that might be involved, particularly when we think about the stressors of being on the low end of the SES system.
We're very proud of the really more broadly the genetic data that are available in regards. Ryan Irwin, I don't know if you happen to have run into her, but she's leading that charge. I tell people I can't spell DNA. It's just not, it's not my area. It's not where I've worked. And so we've got great data. I'd love to get you up with Ryan and she can, but Regards is funded as an R01. And so, that has a lot of funny implications. If you think of other cohort studies, most of them are contracts. And because it's funded as an R01, it has to go through an ordinary study section. So if you submit a $28 million R01 and it goes, these people are reading a $200,000, $28 million, it sort of gets a lot of attention in that study section. And so the budget has been trimmed brutally to try to get it down to 28 million for a 5-year period. And because of that, we do a lot of things where we collect the data, collect the samples, write ancillary studies to try to get it. Regards has 140-ish funded ancillary studies. And so, by the way, if you want to write an ancillary, so we have biorepositories. We have the coolest one was Leslie McClure wrote a NASA grant to measure air pollution at the participants' homes nationwide. I mean, you can get crazy stuff. It's one, but I'm talking too long. I'm going to go sit down. Please come grab me at breaks. Asking me regards questions. I'll tell you about them and then my grandchildren, all in one sentence. But
Thank you, Dr.